Let's open up the Vintage Collection 3.75-inch figure of Bib Fortuna from Return of the Jedi.
Varykino. If it's Star Wars, we collect it.
Hello there, thanks for visiting Varykino. One of my main goals for this year is to open up all of my Star Wars action figures that I've hoarded away for far too long. I've been having a lot of fun opening up my Black Series 6-inch figures over the past couple of weeks, but sadly I haven't opened up quite as many of my Vintage Collection 3.75-inch figures, and I want to fix that. So a couple of days ago I opened up the Black Series 6-inch figure of Bib Fortuna from Return of the Jedi, and it made me remember about the fact that I also have the 3.75-inch figure still on its backing card. I had so much fun opening up the Black Series Bib Fortuna. I want to open up this one and have a little bit of a comparison between the details of these two different scale figures. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Coming up really soon, I'll open up this 3.75-inch Bib Fortuna figure and take a close look at his details. But first, let's take a quick look at the backing card. The backing cards for the Vintage Collection are heavily inspired by the original Kenner backing cards from the 1970s and 80s. Here we can see the Bib Fortuna backing cards side by side, the Vintage Collection here on the left and the original Kenner one from the 80s here on the right. They are both rectangular backing cards with a black background, with the Star Wars logo at the top with a single chrome racetrack design surrounding the film logo, Return of the Jedi in red, and they also both have a single chrome racetrack design surrounding the character art here on the right side. I really like the fact that the Vintage Collection is paying homage to the original Kenner ones, right down to the inclusion of the original Kenner logo as well. Though of course modern photo technology allows Hasbro to really enhance the original promotional image of Bib Fortuna here. The lighting and colors here feel a lot more true to how they appear in the film, and we can see a lot more costume details on this image, though I like the fact that it's still got very similar placement on the backing card compared to the original one. The blue aura in the background on this Vintage Collection one is also a little bit stronger and clearer than on the original one. And they both use a yellow tone for the accent color for Bib Fortuna. Here for the nameplate, they both have a black font simply reading Bib Fortuna, and also as the accent color in behind the character. We can see the Vintage Collection figure of Bib Fortuna here in the clear plastic bubble on the front. We have one figure with a soft goods robe and, interestingly, no accessories. Previous versions of Bib Fortuna in the 3.75-inch line included a staff, a blaster, and a knife, but this version has no accessories. And because it has no accessories, it is missing the choking hazard note that is usually printed on the top right of Star Wars action figure backing cards. Moving on to the back of the backing card, you can see this is a slightly older figure with the now older style of backing card printing. We have the VC number 224, a black background, the Star Wars logo with double chrome racetrack design, and also the Vintage Collection logo here at the bottom, and a lineup of other figures from this particular assortment, characters including Lobot, IG-11, Bo-Katan, and of course Queel there. I unfortunately have a sticker that will not come off. You can see the original retail price here in New Zealand of $29.99. The rest of the backing card is barcode, copyright text, all of that kind of stuff. Now I did buy this one with the intent of opening it. The hanger does have some damage and some marking along this right hand side. He really has been in his bubble for far too long. Let's go ahead and open him up. So now I have Bib Fortuna out of the packaging, and of course he has no accessories, so let's just jump straight in. So something that took me a little bit by surprise, I have to be honest, was the fact that he's got a full soft goods lower robe. My particular figure had the outer robe closed completely over this lower section, and it was a little bit hard to see on the underside, and to be honest I don't always look at the underside of figures while they're still packaged, but of course that makes total sense. He does have a lower skirt to his outfit. That was a really nice surprise. I like this flowy fabric for the robe. This is going to be a lot of fun. But I have to point out that we have a lot of cut edges here because we've got this really fun tiered effect to the back of his robe here. But of course, all of these raw edges means that we're going to get little flecks of fabric coming off. So if there are, you can see there, little black specks on my fingers, that is what is happening. I'm going to try and be very careful with the robe as best as I I can, because it will start to damage the edge. As you can imagine, losing fragments of fabric is not in its best interest. I'm going to handle it very carefully, especially along the edges like this. You can just kind of start to see little lines traveling up the edges of the cut fabric. If you stretch this fabric out, you can kind of create ladders and sort of permanent damage. So I'm going to be very careful, but I do still want to check out all of the details and articulation, of course. So there have been many versions of Bib Fortuna made over the years, and you're always hoping that when they appear in the vintage collection that it's going to be an improvement over earlier versions. So I'm really hoping so. I've got a couple of older figures on hand to a little bit of a fun comparison later on. So he is a odd looking Twi'lek, of course. One might call him ugly. His skin tone is quite different here than some of the other versions. In the vintage era, he was sort of more of a cream, sort of beigey color, but with that modern vintage collection backing card, they really sort of made him look far more pink, and we do see that echoed in modern figures as well. He's much more pink with this interesting sort of blue vein paint job that we have here, where they've kind of done a little bit of a dry brush of a blue over his sort of pebbled textured skin. So it kind of gives the appearance of those sort of blue veins under the skin. Though of course this paint effect is a little bit more of an overtone rather than sort of being an undercolor there. So it's particularly strong here in the front, and it's kind of interesting. Of course, Bib Fortuna has a rather prominent kind of sore or a scar on his front head tail or leku coiled around the front. Because this particular figure has so much of a pebbled texture, it's a little hard to kind of make it out very strongly. It doesn't really appear quite as prominently in the sculpting as it does on some of the other figures. There's kind of a bit of a divot here in the front that is catching the light a lot, but the sore is a little bit more over to the side. You can really see it on the backing card promotional image. Now I do like the face on this one, if you can say like on a character that does look like this. I think it is a good likeness, shall we say. That's probably the better way of putting it here. He doesn't sort of look too some of the other figures, they're really sort of snarling, which I know he does kind of do. He does show his teeth, but this one looks a little bit more of a neutral position. It doesn't look like he's sort of yelling with his teeth bared or anything like that. You can see his teeth in this one. They're very small painted, and of course we've got his red eyes. I do believe this is digital printing just because of the detail on the eyes. That is so tiny, and it doesn't look too googly-eyed like some of those older paint jobs were. So I can see a little bit of white, red pupils, and the black in the center there, which is really nice. And we also have that blue sort of accent wash over the face as well. We've got his ears sculpted in there on the side, and his two head tails, or leku for Twi'lek, are attached. So they are not part of the head sculpt. We can see the seam lines where they are attached. This one has just a tiny little bit of a gap. You can see we've got a little bit of a shadowing in behind the ear. It could be just a tiny bit tighter, but the one on the other side is really nice and tight, which is important because it fits really close to his right ear. So I really like that. Of course, they are tucked around towards the back of the head, so you're not really going to see those joins from the front, but of course we do want them to be really nice and tight. They've got to look like they are growing from his head, not separate. And I do really like the way that they are sculpted to sit. This one kind of looks, you know, like it's got a bit of weight to it, like the weight of it is kind of squashing just a little bit flat in the way that it hangs across the front of his chest, and it coils all the way up onto his shoulder, not quite going all the way over his shoulder. So hopefully that means we'll still be able to turn him around. And again, this one has a little bit of sort of a flatter position here, so it looks like it's laying across his back, scoops down low under his shoulder, and comes around to the front, just touching there at the front leku there, which is really fun. And of course he's got his kind of extra chin bits here hanging down. Some of the older figures have quite short little dangly bits. Here we have them quite long. Overall, I think this is a really good face sculpt for Bib Fortuna. He's not sort of comical, but he still looks sinister. I think the blue is perhaps a little heavy, in certain places. I think it's just catching my eye here where it just seems to have collected, but I know that this type of sort of after effect, this dry brushing on top, will vary a lot from figure to figure, but overall I'm quite happy with this one in terms of just the texture of the skin. I quite like it. Just the sort of subtle creasing, of course, that we get because of course these are sort of prosthetic effects on actors in the original trilogy, so a practical thing that kind of creases, it has sculpting lines to it, so I really like the fact that I can feel those sort of crease lines sculpted into the Hasbro figure here, which is really nice. Overall, I really like the head. You can kind of see how far that chin sticks out there. We can see underneath there's going to be some gapping. I'm hoping that when we go through the articulation we can still turn his head around, because sometimes, particularly with hair or long details hanging down the back, it can really restrict the positions that you can turn the head, but I'm optimistic. It looks like there's a good clearance between his chin and his chest, so I'm hoping we can turn him around. So we've got he kind of wears like a blue tunic. If I move his soft goods robe out of the way just a little bit, he's kind of got like a blue tunic with long sleeves, and then he's kind of got a little bit of sort of like armor plates running down at the front. And I really, really like the paint effects on this figure. I'm trying to hold him very carefully. The mottling effect on this, the metallic paint, is really nice. It's not like a shiny, like a blaster silver or lightsaber hilt or anything like that. It's like a dark gray, metallic, like a gunmetal, that's got that soft little silver metallic fleck to it, so it just picks up on the light, and I really like this finish. You can see the little recessed holes in his chest plate here. These straps run up to the shoulder, then we've got sort of his blue sash around the middle, and then we've got a couple of plates hanging down the front here, this circular curved one and then a rectangular one with horizontal lines, which also have that fantastic mottled metallic. It's like a dark grey metallic and then a lighter grey metallic, all just kind of mottled. And when I look really close, I think I can make out, looking up really close, I could be wrong, but the mottling on this lower section almost looks like a digital print. I gotta say, under my eyes, it looks like I can make out the tiny, tiny dots in the lighter color, I think, which is really fun. But I like the fact that there is like this kind of speckling of this sort of almost like a metallic dust in the plastic that's just catching the light. Really nice. A lot of the other versions have more of a flat grey. I mentioned earlier, I recently unboxed the Black Series 6-inch figure. That one has a much flatter color palette to it, so it's really interesting to see the detail on paintwork on this much smaller 3.75-inch scale figure. I would have expected perhaps something like this on the Black Series. I'm really looking forward to getting those two side by side so I can see them, because this just looks so cool. Love to see that level of detail. And of course on this side we've got his little wrist cuff exposed. I can see that same speckling, and to be honest, I think I still see the digital printing dots as well, which is really fun. And we've got one on the other side, a little bit hidden, tucked away here in the back. So of course his blue tunic goes all the way down to kind of form fingerless gloves here, where he's got his very long pointed fingers and fingernails extending here. Now of course he doesn't have accessories, so we don't really need to test him holding anything, but I think it's going to be really fun. We don't see characters with unique hands like this often. A lot of Star Wars characters have very humanoid hands or completely alien hands. So of course he's got pretty humanoid hands, just longer with these long fingernails. They are curled on this hand. We've got two fingers kind of curled towards the center, like he could hold something, but he doesn't have anything. So it's kind of like, yeah, we curl them a little bit so that he could potentially hold something, but not so obvious that it just looks awkward if he's standing there. Characters where sometimes they give them made up accessories. If you really want to recreate a scene, you're not going to put any accessories in their hands, and then they're just standing there with this weird grasp looking like something's missing. I like the fact this hand in particular is just kind of draped down by his side. He hasn't got just a fake sort of a grasp, like he's going to be ready to hold something, which is kind of fun. I know a lot of fans do want accessories for every figure, but honestly, I don't mind if it doesn't make sense for the character. I don't need some sort of made-up accessory. Like the staff that came with the original Kenner version, we don't see him using that staff, though of course I did like the nod of having the older Bib Fortuna holding the staff in the Book of Boba Fett scenes. I thought that was fun. Right at the end of The Mandalorian, we were introduced to Boba Fett as the daimyo of Tatooine. I thought that was really fun. But of course, this is the Return of the Jedi version that is not really holding anything. So they've given him different accessories over the years: the staff, the blaster, the knife. The Black Series also came with cups. I thought that was an interesting choice. So I don't mind the fact that this doesn't come with any accessories. I always think of him gesturing with his hands when he's sort of being introduced to R2-D2, and the gestures he makes when he's sort of giving commands. So I actually like the fact that he doesn't come with anything. I'm just going to be storing it away in a drawer and forgetting about it, because I like the way that he just sort of looks with his hands, doing those creepy gestures with his fingers. So all good there. Moving on down, we do have some plates tucked here in the back, but I am going to try and remove this soft goods robe. I think that's really going to show us the articulation and the details underneath. So I'm going to save those details until I can get the robe off. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Moving on down, we've got this lovely blue soft goods skirt, which I have to say is a really good color match for the painted blue elements that we already have. Of course, we've got his sort of upper part here of his tunic that comes all the way down his back of the hand here. So we can see the colors really quite close, and that is nice. Sometimes it can be really tricky to get a perfect match between plastic and fabric. Sometimes you really notice it on figures, particularly if it's a section where it's supposed to be fabric up high, like this section is, and of course these sections, but that looks like a pretty good match. It comes all the way down. It's quite long. You can see it's just kind of pushing up on the tops of his shoes, but of course it's fabric. We're not going to have the issue sometimes when you get those plastic skirts where they end up resting more on the skirt rather than their feet, and it can put them in an off-kilter if it's not all sitting perfectly flat. So when they're resting on their skirts and they end up sort of tipping backwards, we're not going to have that issue. And I have to say, he does actually stand up quite well. I haven't played around with the articulation in his knees or ankles or anything like that. He stood up really nicely straight out of the packaging, which was good. Looking underneath just very carefully, he does have sculpted blue pants on underneath here and blue boots. I'm not sure if Hasbro's ever been privy to costume details for Bib Fortuna, because I have to say the color of his boots seems to change with every figure. They either tend to be sort of the same color as his pants and lower robes, and one of the older figures even had black knee-high boots, and some have black ankle boots, so I'm not sure. We're not really seeing that on screen, so I don't know if even Hasbro is making it up at this point or whether they've actually seen a costume references. There is a lot of shedding going on, I'm just noticing. I'm not even really moving this around. It's just starting to shed those little flecks coming off the cloak. So let's take a closer look at this cloak, and then I'm going to try and just carefully remove it, because I do want to check out all of the articulation without potentially risking this in the way. So we've got this really cool dark brown soft goods robe made from the same fabric as the skirt here, which of course means that the edges, they do sit nicely, but this type of fabric, if you go and sort of put sidewise tension on it, you can create these little damaged sort of fraying bits. And if you're going for a sort of a damaged, frayed, weathered look, that's very fun, but I don't really like to sort of weather my figures beyond what they come out of the package. So there's a lot of sewing here, a lot of layers. This back section is kind of sewn here at the waistline, and then if you follow the grain of the fabric, it goes up over the shoulders and is stitched down here in the front and kind of joins here. You can sort of see it looping over the arms here. So we don't have separate sleeves. It's kind of like a little sort of dropped shoulder sort of cut out here where his arms are poking through. You can kind of see it here as well, just sort of loops over his shoulders. And then we have that front section sewn down at that same seam line. Then we have one tier here, a second tier, and then the full length going all the way down to the ground. So none of these edges are turned over and stitched or overlocked or serged, whichever sort of terms you use. So we've got all of these raw edges. We do have a little bit of a turn over here for the collar, where the raw edge is turned back away from the neckline. So we've got the raw edge along here, and we've just got this little row of top stitching, which you can see there, which runs all the way around the back. You can see it just tucked in here and behind his head tails there. So quite a lot of stitching, and I gotta say, it's interesting to see when Hasbro makes these sort of long robes for figures, whether they make them out of plastic or soft goods. It's kind of interesting to see them change their minds across different product lines over the years, because the Black Series figure has plastic robes, this one has soft goods, and of course the vintage one had a soft goods robe, and the Power of the Force 2 one had plastic. So we've seen quite a few different versions over the years. I'm never quite sure, you know, because sometimes I really like the soft goods. I think it just sort of adds a little bit of sort of, it makes me think a lot of the vintage era. A lot of the robes in that era were, you know, soft goods and things like that, and it does help with articulation because the soft goods will simply move a lot freer than a plastic, but sometimes they just sit a little bit awkwardly. I got to say, the way that the tiers are sort of sewn along this edge here, it almost gives a ripped appearance just because of the way that this section here, the turned over collar, kind of sticks out. And so I've got this little bit of a section here before we go in to where the tiered sections are sewn. So this kind of bit just looks, it unfortunately looks like it's been ripped, just the way that the fabric is sitting. It kind of eats in there. So I'm not as fond of the way that this looks along the front, but I know on this scale, that's the best way to sew it. Of course, you know, if we start turning seams over, you start adding a bulk to the fabric and the thing starts to sort of puff up like a ballroom skirt or something like that, because we've got all of these tiered layers, which I guess is why the Black Series one did it in plastic, so they can keep everything sculpted and tight to the body. So I think this one's going to come down to just getting it in the right position to get it to sit and look nice. But overall, I think it looks really cool. I like the colors. The painting on everything that I can see exposed looks pretty good. Of course, the cloak is covering up everything on the back. Taking a closer look at the fingers, of course, we've got that sort of creamy pink skin tone for the fingers, and then we've got yellow tone for the fingernails. So the fingernails on this one kind of sculpted quite large, I have to say. This one here in particular is quite of a large finger point. They are actually kind of pointy. I do feel that sort of prickle against my fingers. The Black Series ones are actually quite sharp, I have to say, and painted reasonably well. There is a little bit of blue curling up on that finger that's curled up. There's blue curling up on that finger, which it really shouldn't, because that's the sleeve, not skin. The other hand is looking a little bit better. Again, oh, we've got a little bit of blue on the inside. When I play around with the arms with articulation, I'll try and show that a little bit better, because we don't have accessories to hide in there, but his hands are kind of closed. But yeah, I don't want to be seeing blue spilling over to where that flesh tone is, but I really, really like that metallic finish. I've got little flecks of this brown fabric all over my hands, so I'm going to be very careful and see if I can remove this cloak. It does seem to just sort of be sitting here. It's not tucked under a plastic section. Some robes are kind of almost semi-attached because of where they're kind of attached and inserted. Okay, we're getting a little bit here of a look at the back of the figure. I'm being very careful. Just doing a bit of a slow reveal here for Bib Fortuna. Okay, there. So I'm going to pop that off to the side. So now we can see all of the detail underneath. So he looks a little thinner, and it kind of gives a little bit of an apron look. So we can see that that front sort of armor plate, as it were, cuts down there, and it loops around to the back where we have a full back plate here, which is interesting. That was completely hidden there underneath. Again, it has that same sort of speckled metallic finish to it, which is really fun. Less of the sort of this light sort of speckled digital printing that's here is not on the back, but it doesn't actually look like it's missing. I kind of like that. This is the same sort of just speckled dark metallic from the top and this that we have here, with just slightly less of that sort of metallic dusting. It's still got a lovely gloss to it. That's really interesting. And I love the sash. So we've kind of got just the sort of fabric ripples here on the sash, but when I turn around to the back, I love the way it's kind of folded and tucked into each other, because it doesn't have a closure, of course, so you'd sort of wrap the sash around and tuck it in at the back. That's really clever, because of course, if you just wind fabric, you got to tuck the ends in somewhere. They've actually thought about how that would close in the back, despite the fact that, of course, if you're dressing him up like you see him in Return of the Jedi, you're never going to see that detail. So I do really appreciate that. That's kind of fun. Of course, if you've ever sort of made a Star Wars costume, it's little details like this that sort of really help. If you ever want to sort of costume as Bib Fortuna, this is a really fun reference, because we never really see him with these costume details without his robe on over the top. So that's really fun. And I like all this sort of it's like armor. I'm not sure how else to describe it, but it's kind of like armor plating there, with all of those horizontal lines coming all the way down almost to the front of the thigh here. But I kind of like the fact that this front plate's just a little bit more weathered and sort of with that sort of mottly light metallic printing on it. That's really nice. And we can see his arms there. So of course, let's go ahead and very carefully lift his skirt so we can check out his leg details underneath. So I just took a moment to very slowly and carefully raise his soft goods skirt up. You can see the stitching for each side seam there, but we do have that raw edge. So I was just being very careful not to stress that edge. And now we can see the lower half here, where he has blue pants and blue ankle boots. Some other versions, notably the Black Series, have all of these vertical stripes on his pants, but I'm not sure if Hasbro is just making things up or reusing parts from other figures, because this vintage collection version has smooth pants. We can see the knee articulation there in the back. A pretty good color match to the blue of the skirt, but when the skirt's all the way down, we're not really seeing these. The sculpting here on the knee is nice. I have to say that the printing for the leg here, this metallic sequence of numbers, is quite close to the front of the leg. It just kind of really catches my eye here at the front. I would have thought it would be more towards the back here. It's kind of on the front, more towards the front of this seam that's sculpted in here. So that's a little distracting, but again, I'm probably not going to see that. I just think that's interesting. And then the boots, the ankle boots, are pretty featureless. There is no seam lines, no stitching details. They are just smooth all over with a bit of a block heel here. We've got a peg hole in the heel there on the underside, but the boots are pretty featureless. Absolutely nothing there. You can see where the articulation is for the ankles. It's up a little bit higher. Sometimes we get a little bit of a cut down a little bit lower, more towards the actual sort of ankle bone there. It's a little hard to show and play around with the actual hip articulation, because a Bib Fortuna has those sort of rubbery armor plates, and the split detail on those side armor plates is more towards the front than to the true side like we get on some figures. So I'm not sure how well we're going to get the articulation. While I've got his soft goods up, I'm going to test out the articulation while we're here, then I can put him back down. And to be honest, I'm not sure that I'm actually going to get much in the way at all. So I'm just going to he's got those rotation swivel attachments here. They look like they sort of cut across at the top of the thigh, so I can rotate his leg around. But I get the feeling those sort of armor plates are going to limit us. Just being very careful. This leg is very stiff. I got to find the right rotation here. That one's not wanting to move. I feel like I'm stressing that attachment point, to be honest. It's really hard to move this leg. I can't get in because of the plastic that's here. So he's not really going to be doing any side straddling. You can kind of see the articulation style in here, but we've just got so much plastic on at the side. Now, not really an action character. I don't need him to be doing big sort of leaps and bounds with his legs, but that's just kind of, it's always that sort of balance, isn't it? The detail and the articulation are sometimes at odds. So there we can see the knee articulation there. That's actually pretty reasonable, getting up quite high there in the back. Let's test out the ankles. The ankles are quite high, but we do still get a reasonable point. That's quite nice. Sometimes with these sort of cuffed pants, oh, we've even get a little bit more of a forward kick too. That's quite nice. Quickly testing out the other knee. We can swivel at the knee as well, of course. You can see that, it's quite nice. Just gonna, oh, he's a bit stiff on this one. Just gotta hold that really carefully. I really don't want to break any of the articulation points. He can swivel there, and we've got that. Yeah, this one's a bit stiff. The other knee, the other leg was better. There we go. Sometimes they just need a little bit of a loosening up, don't they? Straight out of the packaging. Okay, let's get his legs all straight. Yes, interesting that I can't really swivel his hips. I can swivel them sort of side to side, but out to the side, that one wants to. This one is just a bit stuck. So I don't think I'm really going to be using much of the articulation on the lower legs. I do like the way that the sculpting just kind of drapes over the knees, but they're pretty featureless really. We've got the side seam and the inner seam is sculpted into the pants. But yeah, parts like this I suspect we have seen somewhere else tucked under the robes of another figure. I don't think Hasbro's probably spent too much time making completely unique pants for Bib Fortuna hidden under his skirt. So very carefully pulling this down. So I just wanted to touch on those hip plates here, because not every figure has this section here. Of course, I've mentioned I recently opened up the Black Series. The Black Series has a plate here on the front and then this section hanging down the front. But I suppose because Hasbro used a plastic robe that hangs down, the Black Series figure has no plating here or this whole section around the hips here. And normally, if something might obstruct the hip articulation, Hasbro sculpts like a split along the side seam. Now for this figure, that split is here at the front, going all the way up here. So it's not directly at the sides, it's much more towards the front. So that means that we're not really going to get too much of a kick out to the side because we've still got the plastic here. But of course we do have the limitation of the soft goods robe. It's sewn in quite a column. We're not really going to be able to stretch his legs out to the side anyway, because we're going to be completely kept in place by this sort of column, sort of slightly flared skirt. So I can kind of, you know, understand why there's not a huge amount of attention for that sort of position for the legs underneath. We're not going to be doing big kicks. Of course, I've gone and twisted his legs around a little bit, so I'm hoping I'll get him back into a good balance position. Sometimes when you start moving the articulation around, they're going to fight you for balance again. So I might have to spend some time making him stand up again. There we go. Okay, so the lower half of the body is a little bit of a mixed bag. The articulation is there, but it's of course completely limited by these plastic armor plates. They are rubbery to an extent, but just they're only going to flex so wide, and that split is more towards the front than the true side, and we've got soft goods. So if you really want to use him as a base for a custom figure, you could, you know, cut this part off, remove the soft goods. You've got some interesting looking legs that are fairly plain, but ankle boots, I have to say, are a little bit more of a rarer feature in Star Wars figures. A lot of characters tend to wear the knee-high boots that we see on the likes of Han Solo and Imperial officers and things like that. But interesting to see how much detail is here, considering that you don't really see Bib Fortuna with his robe off. So one could say that perhaps it was a little bit of a detriment to sculpt all this plastic on the back, because it is limiting what we can do with his legs, but then we've got the soft goods anyway. So roundabout, I don't mind that it's there. It's fun. We expect a lot of articulation in the legs for the vintage collection line, but I don't think Bib Fortuna necessarily needs it. So I know the same could be said for certain Princess Leia figures that have a plastic lower goods skirt. Technically their legs are articulated on the underside, but because there is this big plastic skirt, we're never really going to utilize all of those articulating points in the legs. So yeah, it's one of those sort of situations where Bib Fortuna is not really going to be doing high kicks, but it's there. So the main articulating points for him are going to be in his arms, his neck, and around the waist here. So let's test out his waist. Tight, but then he is straight out of his bubble. Oh, it's that kind of clicky one, which I'm not the fondest of. I like it when I can move them. I feel like I'm waiting for something to sort of click or pop or, dare I say it, snap. He does, you know, get there eventually, but I feel like I'm really sort of pulling against him. It's kind of a bit clicky. There's sort of certain stop points. He's not fluid. I can feel that sort of clicking point, but he does turn around all the way to the side. Any more than that starts to look odd. In terms of front and back, not really. Technically, there's a little bit, it's not changing his position. I can rock it, that's it. It's not actually staying in any position there. Almost negligible there. With his head, okay, I'm hoping that the clearance under his chin means that we can move them around. I really don't want to drag those little extra chin bits. Now I'm getting a lot of sort of drag with this one over his shoulder. So if I kind of pull that out of the way, I can get him to look completely over his shoulder. That's a little bit awkward, but you can work. And I feel like I'm putting a lot of pressure on this head tail in particular, resting over this arm. So that's not really how I want to do it. On this other side, again, I'm hitting the arm with this head tail, but you can get there. It feels a bit awkward, and I risk kind of scuffing the paintwork onto this head tail, and he just looks really awkward turning all that way there. In terms of up and down, I'm actually surprised with how much I can do there, and he actually stays in position. So you can have it sort of with the head tail almost completely flat on the back. Of course, we need a little bit of breathing room for the cloak, and I can tip his neck all the way down. It's just touching those little extra plastic chin dangly bits there, but it's not actually kind of really hitting and bending those. So you can actually rock him backwards and forwards. It's mainly this part hitting on his back that is the limiting factor, which is quite nice. So I was really sort of a bit worried with having so much plastic looping around his shoulders and his neck that it would really lock his head in place. But you can turn him about as much as you'd probably want to be turning him. Of course, these are pretty much sculpted in place. They have a little bit of flex when you get to those thin tendrily ends, but you're not repositioning them completely. They are pretty much sculpted in shape. So then you're not going to sort of twist them around the other way or hang them straight or anything like that. They are completely fixed in place. Let's quickly go over his arms. So he's just got these really thin fitted sleeves, which generally shouldn't get in the way of pretty much anything. We've got this little bit here that's just a little bit out of the way. I'm just going to move that just so I can get his arm all the way up. There we go, completely up, nice. Let's check out to see how well we can swivel them up. That's quite nice. Quite tight and close to the body. This one, again, that leku might just get in the way a little bit. I'll see if I can swivel this up. His leku is just kind of catching, yeah, it's just a little bit catching there. If I flick it out of the way, we can get it like that. Looks a bit odd. We're probably not going to be posing him like that, but they can go quite up and close to the body, which is nice. Okay, good rotation there, because of course those little shoulder straps are quite high, so that even the articulation there is a bit exposed. We've got pretty slender elbows, no costume details or armor plates or anything like that getting in the way. He holds his arms up quite easily. We can rotate at those elbow points there as well. So sometimes when we've got large costume details here on the wrists, sometimes we have a swivel point here, or sometimes on the upper arm we don't have any swivel points that I can see there. We can rotate the hands at the wrists as expected, and of course because he's wearing very flat fitted gloves, you can see the articulating point there on the back of the hand. That one is going to go up and down, and the same on the other hand. So let's test that out, see how much movement we're actually going to get. Okay, you can kind of do that, that's fun. Straight, and let's see if we can go back. very small. Yep, we can actually go a fair bit way back. So that's actually kind of fun. So you can do some interesting gestures. They're very tight because they're very small little articulating points. I'm being as careful as I can while still showing that off. While I'm bending his arms around, let's just see if I can have a quick little look in. Yeah, it's very, very hard to show. There's just a tiny little bit of blue on the inside of that pointed finger right by my fingernail there. And then on this side, let's see. I think this one is pretty good. It's mostly that one there. It's in the shadow, but you can see the blue just kind of licks up the inside of that pointed finger, which shouldn't be there. But from the front, they're actually coiled in just the way to kind of completely hide it. It's very hard to show. So I'm glad for that. Of course, that is going to be very much specific to my figure. Of course, those tiny little paint details are going to be different from figure to figure. These fingers are actually pointy. I had that same problem with the Black Series one. When you're trying to move the hand around, they're actually really sharp and they leave like little points in your fingers. But overall, he looks pretty cool. And of course, I can't really speak to the position of the fingers because we don't have a blaster with a enclosed trigger guard or anything like that. I can't imagine trying to get him to sort of hold a long fingernail finger into a trigger guard. I know one of the older figures had a blaster, but figures back then were just very solid grips. So he looks great. I like the fact that we get these slender build characters in the vintage collection era. A lot of those other ones, they were kind of hefty figures. The plastic robes really built out the body. I think of Bib Fortuna as, you know, obviously when we see him later on in the Mandalorian era, he's a little bit of a bigger guy. But I like the build on this figure. I think it's appropriate. And he's just really cool. I know he's one of these sort of characters where, you know, he's not everyone's favorite. Some of these characters, they end up being peg warmers. But I think this is a really cool figure. He's such an iconic character. He's got some, you know, well-known phrases. And he's just fun. Every Jabba's Palace scene needs a Bib Fortuna. So let's get his robe back on and let's do some quick comparisons with a few other figure versions that I have on hand. Let's take a quick comparison look between the Vintage Collection 3.75 inch and the 6-inch Bib Fortuna that I just recently opened up. If you want the full review of this one, I'll have it linked down below. Interestingly, they both have that pinky tone for the skin with a blue accent over the top. For the Vintage Collection, it's more of like a dry brush. For the Black Series, it looks like a wash because of the sort of the patches that it makes. I kind of like the Vintage Collection one a little bit better. Of course, this one has a plastic cloak, so it fits really nice and close to the body. This one was made in 2 parts. I don't like the front edge of this one, but I don't know how else you would do it better. And of course, if you use plastic, you lose a lot of articulation. This one uses plastic for the underskirt as well. You can see that they have added splits to aid in the articulation. This Black Series version of Bib Fortuna has blue pants underneath his lower robe with black ankle boots. I thought that was interesting that the Vintage Collection has blue ankle boots. And of course, opening up the robe, you can see that this one has no hip plates. On the Vintage Collection, this sort of texture here wraps around the back of the figure and comes round to the front. On this one, we only have those front panels, and also the straps holding it up onto Bib's shoulders are blue, the same as his tunic. On this one, that metallic grey goes all the way over the shoulders and onto the plates on the back. This one doesn't have any plates on the back. And also the finish on this one is just a very matte finish grey. No metallic, no speckle, no digital printing. To be honest, it looks a little bit plain when compared to the fantastic paint finish of the Vintage Collection figure. They have similar amounts of articulation. I think I kind of like the face on this one. He looks a little bit creepy. We've got a little bit more of the teeth exposed. This one, you just get a little bit of those sort of pointy teeth showing. But I do wish that the sort of the sore or the scar on his leku was just a little bit more visible on this smaller scale one. I can see it clearly on the Black Series figure. It's very clear on the promotional image. I just wish it was a little bit more sort of accented and obvious here on the front. And as you can see, the fingers on these ones are actually sculpted sculpted in very similar points, with the right hand having those fingers curled. You can see that this one has the same kind of pose, and the other hand just has that kind of a little bit of a curl with the fingers, similar to this one. So it's kind of fun seeing these figures side by side, opening them up so close together. Let's grab a couple of other 3.75-inch figures from yesteryear and just have a bit of fun looking at the comparison between those ones as well. Here is a trio of 3.75-inch Bib Fortuna figures from my collection. Here we have the vintage Kenner one from the 1980s, the Power of the Force 2 Bib Fortuna from 1997, and the vintage collection one. You can see some very different approaches here. I like the color and the head sculpt on this one, by far the clear winner. It's interesting to see the primitive soft goods robe from the vintage collection one. Of course, it is missing all of the tears, though it does impressively have a stitched collar. I thought that one was quite nice. And of course, we have different accessories. This one has a small blaster, that interestingly made up shaped staff. And of course, this one, they didn't even bother trying to make up an accessory for him. He just looks cool with his hands. This one, of course, has that big plastic cape that just kind of hangs over the figure. It was a bit of an awkward way, but a lot of the Power of the Force figures use this technique. I think this one looks so much better. I think the body proportions look great. I love the articulation, the paint job. If this is the one that is in your collection, this is a massive step up. I think this one looks really cool. I'm just going to be very careful with the cloak because I just don't want to stress those raw edges. But other than that, that is just my own personal little thing about taking care of the soft goods effects on these figures. I think he looks fantastic, and I think he looks much better out of the backing card, to be honest. I think that the way that the soft goods, while they weren't messy, they just hid a lot of the detail, and I think he looks really cool. Can't wait to add him to my Jabba's Palace display. These ones might go a little bit more towards the back now that I've got a much better one to put in display. So this has been so much fun, getting him out of his packaging, checking out the details, and just having a little bit of a fun look back at some other figures. Of course, I still love all my older Star Wars figures, but it's fun to see each new version coming out in the vintage collection. Fingers crossed the vintage collection continues on for years and decades to come, because there are so many characters I want to see in this fantastic Star Wars action figure line. I really have so much fun opening up each and every one, so I really do need to get on and open up all of the other ones that I still have stored away waiting to be opened and released from their packaging. So I'm going to have so much fun this year opening them all up. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today as I opened up another Star Wars vintage collection figure and had just so much fun. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening wherever you are in the galaxy, and let's hang out again very soon for more Star Wars fun. May the Force be with you. If you're a vintage collection fan, I recently opened the Moff Jerjerrod figure, VC224. That video is linked here in case you haven't already seen it, as well as a whole vintage collection playlist. This is the way.